Hello everybody, it's Kenneth from the archives here with another video delving into the past. And today we're going to use our collections to take a step back in time and look at Dundee's High Street in the 19th century. Our first stop's going to take us back a little further to 1793 and William Crawford's map of Dundee of that year. As you can see, three buildings are highlighted as being of great significance in the High Street. At the west end on the left of the picture, marked number 4, was the building known as the English Chapel, later known as Union Hall. At the right hand side, numbered 9, was the Trades Hall, and in the centre, numbered 6, was arguably Dundee's most significant building of the time, the Town House. If we flash forward a few years later to 1846, we can see that although there had been changes with new streets connecting to the High Street, these three buildings remained prominent. Now, the most significant of them, and indeed arguably the most iconic lost Dundee building, was the Town House. Built to a design by William Adam in the 1730s, for around 200 years this building was very much a symbol of Dundee. And the pictures we have here are the 20th century. Indeed, the one on the left must be relatively soon before it was taken down in the 1930s, as the new square had already taken shape around. Now, I'm not going to say too much about the Town House today because the saga of it coming down is a long, complicated and controversial story. Maybe something we can look at in a future video. The buildings I want to concentrate on today are these two, the Trades Hall and Union Hall, as the English Chapel became known. And these are two 19th century drawings of them that appear in books that we have in the Kinnear local collection. Now, we also have a couple of very nice photographs of them. These come from an album called Dundee Old and New, which we have a copy of in the Peter Carmichael of Arthurstone collection. And this album was made between 1870 and 1880 to chronicle changes that were taking place in Dundee at that time, and to give a sort of before and after effect. Because by the 1870s, indeed by the 1860s, there were a lot of people were concerned about how Dundee looked. Dundee wanted to be an ambitious modern town, but there were some people felt the buildings didn't match this. There were also genuine social housing problems, overcrowding. Streets were seen as too narrow for modern traffic. All these things were factoring in, because basically the population of Dundee had exploded in a very short time period due to the Industrial Revolution. And so it was the case that in 1871 Dundee got an Improvement Act, which allowed the police commissioners to take steps to build new buildings, take buildings down, widen the streets, build new streets. And this meant the centre of Dundee, including the High Street, would radically change. Now, these two buildings here would be victims of this change. Now, I just want to say a little bit about both of them. They were both designed by Samuel Bell, Dundee's borough architect. And if you look at the Trades Hall in particular, you can see echoes with a surviving Bell building that survives today, St Andrew's Parish Church, which is not surprising in some ways, as it was the Trades Kirk and this was the Trades Hall. Now, you can see fairly clearly where the Trades Hall sat. It sat in front of what would later become the Clydesdale Bank. Indeed, the Clydesdale Bank in this picture has just been completed. Facing it at the opposite end of the High Street was the Union Hall. Now, the Trades Hall dates from 1776, the Union Hall dates from the 1780s, being completed in 1785. As I said, originally it was called the English Chapel, and this was because it was originally used by a congregation of Episcopalians. There was a split in the Episcopal Church at this time, and this meant there were two rival congregations in Dundee. Now, eventually they reunited, and St Paul's Cathedral is in some ways a descendant of the church that met there. And of course, once they moved out, it was used as a hall, and Union Hall was the name it went by. And again, you can see the two buildings did sort of complement each other in architectural style. And given they're the same architect, that's not really surprising. So why would you want to get rid of these buildings? Well, there's two big reasons. One is it's felt they're old-fashioned. Dundee wants to be modern and forward-looking. It doesn't really want 18th century relics. Now, today this view would seem quite shocking, but in the Victorian period this wasn't uncommon. And if you look at the newspaper reports for this time, they weren't so much concerned about these buildings coming down as they were concerned that they weren't coming down quickly enough. The other reason is you could argue they were getting tatty. Now, if we look at the Union Hall picture in particular, you see it's covered in posters. It looks quite run down. We can see that with the Trades Hall a little bit. Another factor which you need to take into account is they were never really used for the purposes they were intended to be used for, i.e. as civic halls, for very long. They struggled to get regular events meeting in them, and they were very often let out. Indeed, the Trades Hall, towards the end of its life, was being used as the Clydesdale Bank. So it was felt they would have to go. And another factor was, as I mentioned, the Improvement Act wanted to widen streets. And if we look at the High Street, we can see that the four main thoroughfares connecting with it, Seagate, Overgate, Nethergate and Murraygate, all narrowed at the end. And this meant that the eastern and western entries to the High Street were fairly tight and they needed to be widened. And that meant taking the two halls down. Also in the case of Murraygate, as we can see in the picture on the left here, they actually took down buildings at the end of the street and widened it. And this happened to quite a lot of the other streets as well. As we can see from the map from 1889, Union Hall and Trades Hall have disappeared. They've been gone about 10 years by that point. And we have a wider Murraygate, a wider Seagate, a wider Overgate and a wider Nethergate, providing nice access to the High Street. Now, they weren't the only buildings to go at this time. Also lost at this time was one of Dundee's oldest surviving buildings and one of Dundee's popular ancient buildings at the time. That's how it was described anyway, Our Lady Workstairs. A lovely name. There's all sorts of theories to the origins, which I'll not bore you by going into now. But you can see here it's stood beside Union Hall and was, as I say, recognised in the press as a remarkable survivor of an earlier age. It probably dates from around the 16th century. But its demolition was actually celebrated. Dundee shouldn't be looking back, the argument went. Dundee should be looking forward, and we need to widen the Nethergate, so this has got to go. So poor Our Lady Workstairs went in 1879, a year or two after the Trades Hall and Union Hall. So what replaced them? Well, as I've said before, they built the Clydesdale Bank behind the Trades Hall, and then when the Trades Hall was taken down, it became the new building flanking the eastern end of the High Street. Also round about, we got the big new buildings that would house department stores. So the corner, which you can't quite see in this picture, that housed J.L. Wilson. We got the building that would eventually be D.M. Brown's, and just behind the old Clydesdale Bank there, you can see the big department store on the corner of Commercial Street and Murraygate that would become Smith Brothers. Commercial Street itself was extended at this time, so originally it had terminated at the Seagate. It now cut through behind where the Clydesdale Bank was and would continue up to the Meadows, or as we know it today, Albert Square. At the other end of the High Street, there really was just a bit of a gap left where the Union Hall had been. It meant that Monk's Lodging, which we've talked about in a previous video, became a little bit more prominent. So there were some old bits of Dundee were kept at this time period. And for the moment, the townhouse would survive. I say for the moment because already at this time there were people saying, this is very old-fashioned. This doesn't really befit a city as Dundee was aspiring to be at that point. This doesn't really fit a city that wants to be a modern go-ahead and centre. We've got great townhouses being built in England. We've got great city chambers being built elsewhere in Scotland. Do we really want this old building? And although there were some extensions done, there was nothing radical done at this point, although there was certainly talk of doing it. And over the next few years, the issue of what to do with the townhouse would become a big one. But we'll save that story for another time. Okay, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and we'll see you soon.